In this video, I would like to talk about ideas that went into the Constitution of the United States, and I would also like to talk about some ideas that were left out of the Constitution of the United States and how leaving them out came back to interact with what was put into, with the ideas that were in fact put into the Constitution. So first and foremost, the idea of separation of powers was suggested to the founders by Charles Montesquieu, who wrote this enormously important book called The Spirit of Laws. And in it, he argued that if you separate powers between the three branches, executive, legislative, and judicial, you are less likely to get a despotic, meaning oppressive government. And as you might know from my other lecture, the founders created three branches of government. Article 1, Legislative Act, Article 2, Executive, Article 3, Judicial. There was never any argument at the Constitutional Convention about the need to have three branches of government. The argument was exactly how you structure them. So the answer to how you structure them, based on the principles of checks and balances, was you create the House of Representatives based on population, just like big states, populous states like Virginia wanted, and then you can also create, you actually do create second house, second chamber called the Senate, and that's based on equality, just like small states such as New Jersey wanted. So as I explained, you have the House based on population and the Senate based on the equality of the states, and that's your Congress. It has two chambers, bicameral Congress, two chambers, and each chamber would balance each other out to some extent, because the Senate represents the states as a whole, but the House represents the people directly, or the districts populated by the people. So you have separation of powers with each branch checking and balancing each other, but you also have within the branches, you can have checks and balances also going on. For example, the two different chambers of Congress are checks and balances on one another, and they are competitive with one another to some extent. You also have disagreement as to how to elect president. Some thought Congress should pick president, others said no, that violates separation of powers. And so they settled on having electoral college, that is to say, the voters would elect president indirectly by first casting votes for their electors, and then the electors would choose the president. And we will discuss later on about how exactly electoral college works when we will talk about presidency, and also when we will talk about campaigns and elections. So in addition to the two chambers of Congress, they created the executive branch, and that branch was to have far less power than Congress. Remember, separation of powers and checks and balances do not imply that each branch was equal in power. The legislative branch was meant to be supreme. So the executive branch, you have president leading that branch, and then there would be a bunch of executive agencies of which he would be the head, but which would be created and funded by Congress. And then you would also have the judicial branch, and there would be one Supreme Court in the judicial branch, and such other courts as Congress would from time to time establish. Now, in addition to these checks and balances between the branches of government, and sometimes within the branches of government, checks and balances also includes the idea of people being balanced against the national government and the government being balanced against the people. Remember, the idea was not only, for the founders, was not only to create a government that was not oppressive, but also to create a government that would not be subjected to mob rule. To them, the masses were not to be trusted. To them, the masses were the mob. And if you allowed them too much power, you would have chaos and you would have despotic rule of the mob. So while the government has to be checked by the people also have to be checked by the government. It's very important to keep that in mind. And also, the national government would be balanced against the states, and the states would be balanced against the national government. And also the people would be balanced against their state governments, and the state governments would be balanced against the people. Remember, even today, even in the 21st century, about 95% of all laws are actually state laws, and limitations on our freedoms most of the time come from state governments, from state laws. So we are checked as people. We are checked by state governments and the laws they pass, but we as people also check the state government and the laws that the states pass. Now, the next idea is the idea of political parties and coalitions, and neither of these ideas are explicitly stated in the Constitution. In fact, the founders were hoping that political parties would never form in the United States because the political parties were bad in their view. Why? Because they tended to exacerbate political conflict. So how did the founders think politics would play itself out? They thought it would play itself out by people coming together into temporary alliances known as coalitions. These alliances would form around specific leaders or around specific political issues, and then when leaders die or retire or political issues get resolved, coalitions get dissolved, and then new issues, new leaders arise, you have new coalitions. They believed this to be preferable to political parties because, once again, coalitions are fluid, but political parties are more or less permanent. So they tend to ossify political conflict and exaggerate it. And in fact, we see that the founders were not all seeing, not all wise, not all knowing, because political parties would be formed very quickly after the Constitution was written. By 1796, we had two major political parties, one known as the Federalist Party and another known as the Democratic Republican Party. And in fact, some of the founders also became founders of the original two political parties. We also see today that every democracy in the 20th century and in the 21st century, every democracy has political parties because they're necessary to select candidates and get them elected. Elections in a modern democracy are unimaginable, unthinkable without political parties. John Adams became the leader of the Federalist Party, even though its intellectual founder should be considered Alexander Hamilton. But Adams took over the party because Adams was our first vice president and then our second president. Hamilton, for his part, left politics to pursue legal career in New York, and he was very busy with his legal career. Thomas Jefferson and James Madison became the co-founders of the Democratic Republican Party. James Madison did a lot of organizational work, but he doesn't get really credit for it. And so Thomas Jefferson is considered really the founder of the party, somewhat unfairly. Election of 1800 was the first partisan election. It was very visceral, shrill, very personal. Jefferson's people and Adams's people attacked the opposing candidates. I say their people because they directly did not attack each other. It was considered bad form in the year 1800, but they personally were definitely behind the attacks that others launched on their behalf. And so the underlying passions stemmed not only from personal tension and even animosity between Jefferson and Adams, they actually stemmed from real differences over the vision of the country, the vision that it should follow. Now, why do I bring this up in connection to the Constitution if this stuff is not in the Constitution? Precisely so you would understand how general and vague the Constitution was and is as to the nature of the country, as to what the country should look like, should feel like, how it should operate economically, what the future of the country should be. These things were left out of the text of the Constitution. And so, because of this, the Constitution lends itself to more than one possible vision. And you had very early on two different visions. One was the vision of Alexander Hamilton / Federalist vision, and another vision was that of Thomas Jefferson. So Hamilton wanted to see the country where you had a lot of commerce and finance flourish. By commerce, we mean trade, both national trade and international trade. Hamilton also envisaged America based on big cities and based on industry, urban and industrial America. Hamilton was an admirer of England, and he believed the United States should emulate England closely, particularly with respect to rapid industrialization and the growth of commerce and finance. So, how did England become so powerful? Alexander Hamilton argued it was able to build a powerful navy and to field a powerful army because it had big cities with big factories. And this is what we have to strive for. Big cities, urbanization, and a lot of factories, industrialization, and then railroads, and also trade. We want to have trade, particularly within our country's borders. Hamilton was a bit suspicious of international trade, and in fact, he urged the United States to pass a high tariff against foreign goods so that American manufacturers would not be pressured by foreign competition against which they might not immediately stand up. So they needed time to develop before they could fully face the onslaught of global competition. Now, Thomas Jefferson had a very different vision. He believed in rural America of predominantly independent farmers. He was an admirer of France. France was behind Great Britain when it came to industrialization. So Jefferson had this romantic vision of most Americans living as independent farmers, which back in his day, in 1800, was not really so much a vision as a reality. The vast majority of Americans were farmers. And those who were not usually were small-scale business people. So he tended to view this farm life, the romanticism of farm life, as an alternative to the greed, corruption, the avarice of the cities that actually led to wage slavery. Why wage slavery? Because in a big city, you could not grow your own food. You were not independent. You had to rely on someone else to give you a job. And that was kind of intolerable for Thomas Jefferson because it created economic dependence. And with economic dependence, there would come psychological dependence. So it put you into an unenviable dependent state. And Thomas Jefferson didn't like that. So the Democratic-Republican Party stood for Jefferson's vision. The Federalist Party was close to Hamilton's vision. It's interesting that the Democratic-Republican Party of Jefferson kept winning election after election after election. As you can see, they won the election of 1800, then 1804, then 1808, then 1812, 1816, 1820. By 1820, the Federalist Party disappeared. First, already by 1812, it became a regional party. Concentrated in the extreme northeast. But by 1817, really, it already stopped operating. So you really had a one-party system between 1817 and, let's say, 1824, 1825. And despite Democratic-Republican victories, ask yourself, who won the future? Which vision won the future? The Democratic-Republican vision of Thomas Jefferson or the Federalist vision of Alexander Hamilton? The answer could not be more obvious. Clearly, Hamilton's vision carried the day. And you can see that already by the middle of the 19th century. 50, 60 years after this election of 1800, it was clear that Hamiltonians won the future. We had big cities, we had big factories, a lot of trade, and rural areas became, relative to the rest of the country, less and less populous. And if you look today in the 21st century, the agricultural sector employs approximately 1.5% to 2% of the population, and it accounts for a tiny fraction, for approximately the same fraction of the country's GDP, gross domestic product. And cities and suburbs are far, far more populous than rural areas. So clearly Hamilton won the future, even though his political enemies won elections. What does it have to teach us about politics and elections in particular? Uh, that elections might not be the end all and be all of politics. They might not be as important as we sometimes think. We sometimes catastrophize election results if they go our way, or we feel elated about them if they go our way, and we catastrophize them if they go against our preferences. But in fact, winning elections does not guarantee that the side that wins elections wins long-term future. Thanks.